Well, welcome back, everybody, for our final session of our two-day Somatic Trauma Healing Summit. My name is Allison, and I'm your host for this session. And we just wanted to mention today that as we join together, we want to recognize, honor, and celebrate that today is Juneteenth. And today is a day dedicated to recognizing justice and freedom for African Americans and Black people in America. And we also recognize that there is still so much more work to do, both in the US and across the world. So, thank you everyone for joining for this session with Dr. Scott Lyons. It is the intersection of somatic attachment therapy and trauma healing. Dr. Scott Lyons is a licensed clinical psychologist, doctor of osteopathy, and mind-body medicine practitioner who specializes in therapies for infants, youth, and adults. Scott is the creator of the Embody Lab, a hub for embodied education, self-discovery, and healing, and developer of somatic stress release, a process of restoring our biological adaptation system. Scott is also founder of Omala, Wellness Tools for Transformation. So thank you for being here, Scott, and we will let you take it away.
Thanks. I didn't really have a choice to be here. I'm happy to be here. Hi, everyone. How's the summit going so far? Good? Oh, yay. It's also great to see so many familiar faces. I recognize that this might be the first session for some of us. It also is likely to have been the second or third or fourth session of today or of the weekend. And so I really wanted to start with a practice as opposed to jumping into a PowerPoint or anything like that. So I hope that works for everyone. And if not, we'll get to a PowerPoint. So don't you worry. And with that, this practice will probably be about 15 to 20 minutes max. So I just want to set the expectations for how long it will be. And with that, I'm going to invite you to find a comfortable seated or lying down position, whatever really supports you right now. And if you are sitting, I'm just going to invite you to, if it feels good, to place a hand on your head. We're just going to find a little bit of movement. Some gentle exploration, easy movements. It can be on your head. You might just feel the weight of your hand on your head as it supports some gentle movement, if that feels possible. And then you might migrate your hand if you wish to keep touching to your neck and chest, shoulders, finding just a gentle movement here as well. If there's a little sound or exhale that wants to come with this movement, just inviting that to release as well. And then if you wish, you can keep lowering your hand to your abdomen, torso, just finding a little gentle movement of the organs or the torso here. And again, if there's any breath or exhale that wants to emerge as a release. And letting the hands, if you wish to come down to your pelvis, finding a little movement in the pelvis as well. And then we'll add in the legs if that's available. This movement of the legs and feet. And if there's anywhere we might have missed, just wants to be moved, your eyes, your mouth, your back. Just taking the next few moments to offer some movement. And then finding a pause. And as you find a pause in the movement, I invite you to find a position of sitting or lying where there is comfort. And then even a little bit more permission of finding that much more comfort. Or can you offer just even a little bit more comfort to yourself in this moment? And as you find that comfort, I'm going to invite you to begin to feel or tune into a sense of the weight of your body pouring down. Like from the top of your head, a waterfall of weight. Pouring down, releasing down into gravity. You're always welcome to let your eyes stay open or closed. As that waterfall of weight pours down from your head, through your spine, or through the torso. And that waterfall of weight continues to flow into gravity through your abdomen and pelvis. This pouring, this waterfall of flow, of weight from your head down through your torso, abdomen, and pelvis. Yeah, see where it might be okay to say yes, just to allowing that weight to flow down into gravity. And as that weight flows down through you, it meets the supportive surface beneath you, whether that's a chair or the ground. And as that waterfall of weight, the weight of you, flows down into this supportive surface, see where you might be able to give permission for that supportive surface, that chair, that ground, just to receive that weight. It's almost like giving the permission to the chair, the ground itself, to receive you, to receive you. And where you might be able to say yes or give yourself permission to receiving the support of that chair, of that ground, that earth. Where we begin to sense perhaps a flow between ourself and the chair and the supportive surface and us, where we are being received and receiving. Where we are being received by the chair, by the earth, and at the same time receiving the support. Where there's this flow between you and the supportive surface. And as you feel this flow, this connection of support, of being received and receiving, we're going to add in our imagination or think of someone where we have a lot of ease and comfort with. And we'll imagine them or invite them into our space. Imagining or inviting someone into our space where we have a lot of ease, a lot of support with. And if we can't find someone, we might just imagine a higher self, a version of us. And as we invite them into the space, we're going to be practicing the same process as we begin to just receive them, receive the presence of that person. Whether that's how they look, or the feeling of them in the space, or even the smell. Receiving them in, almost like sipping them in, their presence in. And as we receive them, as we take their presence in, they can also begin to receive us. Taking in our presence, taking in quality of us. Knowing that we're not giving anything away or taking anything in from them. It's just a flow of receiving presence. As we receive them, they're receiving us. There's this flow, this exchange. Where we are seen and being seen, where we are being seen and we are seen, where we are feeling and being felt. Taking even just a little bit longer, being in this flow, this exchange, even if it's just a little bit. Just noticing how the whole of you responds to this sense of flow between you and them, this sense of seeing and being seen. And as we begin to transition, we might say our goodbyes to them, or we might just invite them to stay and hang out in this space. As we begin to find a gentle movement side to side, a way of coming back a little bit more to our own body, our own sensations, our own breath. I invite you to slowly open your eyes as a continuation of the practice. In your eyes, where your senses just gently move through your space. Until perhaps your eyes or another sense lands on something that feels supportive, something pleasurable, perhaps. Something outside the window or inside the roof space. And as you locate whatever it is in your space that feels pleasurable, comforting, take a moment to receive it in the same way. Whether that's receiving the sound of it or the smell or the sight, the colors of it. And while this may be a bit different, perhaps imagining whatever it is in the space also receiving you, seeing you, experiencing you as you experience it. And then when you're ready, shifting just to the sense of the space, where your breath is flowing in from the space, receiving that oxygen. On the exhale, that space, receiving your carbon dioxide, receiving the exhale. So even here in this space, there's this flow of receiving and being received, this exchange. And then when you're ready, shifting your focus, perhaps finding a little bit of rocking once again. And from the experience of whatever you're sensing right now, I'm just going to invite you to write a few words down, perhaps onto a journal or piece of paper. How would you describe the quality of experience of what that flow, that exchange? How might you describe the quality or the felt experience of connection? And I'll put that question on the slide just so you can see it. So there's another way of saying that, just so you have the visual of the question, just to write down for a moment. how would you describe from this experience the idea or the concept of connection or relation? Yeah. And I'm going to open up the chat. And I'm just going to invite folks to kind of share words, that describe the felt experience of what we might call connection or that reciprocal relation. So alive, energetic, reassuring, smoothness, grief, appreciation, spaciousness, warmth, present, wholeness, fullness, necessary, empowered, supported, a little spaced out, calming, fresh, mirroring, feeling seen, resistance, great awareness, dance, sleepy, existence, nourishment. Yeah, and some of us might have noticed our own relationship to that process where there were maybe some experiences of challenge or disconnect. Yeah, and all of that is good information. Yeah, all of that turns into is wisdom. Yeah, nourishing flow, calmness, love. Yeah, great. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm just going to pause the chat again. Thank you for your beautiful and articulate sharings of that experience. As we go in and we'll talk about relational dynamics in just a moment, and as some of you might know, or as the class is talking about attachment theory or attachment therapy, somatic attachment therapy, as we enter into the conversation of relationship, we can often have a theoretical understandings or concepts of relationship. It looks this way. I saw a relationship on television or Instagram, or what my parents told me it was, or my school teachers, or the fantasies of relationship. And as we enter into the conversation from a therapeutic perspective around relationships, bonding, connection, attachment, it's really important that we come back to what is our own experience. What is the true felt experience of connection, of relationship? Because as we enter into the world of trauma healing, we'll want to have some reference of what we're coming home to. Yeah. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a few moments. So before I talk about attachment theory or attachment therapy, it's helpful for us to just talk about somatics. Now, I know many of you have already attended several of the sessions, so there's some familiarity with, or quite a bit of familiarity with somatics, but I'm just going to review a little bit of it. So soma means the living body. And when we're talking about somatics, what we're referring to is how do we experience ourselves? And then it extends, because as an extension of us, how do we experience things like connection, relationship? Yeah. So it's moving from away from the concept of something to actually how do we experience it? And we might experience that through different qualities or textures or rhythms or timing or flavors. Yeah. And it's below the level, or more primal to the level of verbal dialogue. Yeah. So whether we speak English or German or Swiss or whatever our language is that we learn to speak verbally or sign language. Yeah. Our first and universal language is our body, our sensation, our feelings, our movements, our breath. It's how we come to experience ourselves, literally as infants. Yeah. The mapping of who and how we are doesn't come when we get into like high school and we figure out what clique we belong to, or anything like, or the job we take on, or anything like that. A sense of who and how we are comes from very early in our developmental process. And it comes from movement. It comes from, oh, this part connects to this part. I feel that through movement. Oh, I'm beginning to map a sense of where I am, and and who I am by the experience of feeling myself, and then feeling myself in relation to the world, to the environment, to the earth, to other people. Yeah, and this way of experiencing ourselves. And some of you might have know other terms like the implicit, or know that as like implicit memory or body memory, doesn't have a attached sense of time to it. So when we are experiencing ourselves or having a direct experience of something in relation to the world, and it's processed through our primal language of the body, it's not stamped with a signature of time, meaning it's not like this date at this time we experience this particular thing. We just experience. And how that becomes a little very interesting and very challenging in terms of what we'll get into in terms of early developmental relations with our caregivers and trauma, is that these experiences that get stuck in our body, in our body memory, don't know that it's not happening. There's not a time stamp. So the past is the present. Yeah. And our past is our present. And when we think about our future is also built on our past, which we're projecting into the future. So our sense of time from this body experience isn't the same as like what we call autobiographical, or we don't know it by date. We just have experience. And that will become really important as we look at trauma healing towards the end of our session together. Yeah. Meaning we can't just go back and process an event. Yeah. We can only process how we are in this moment. Okay. All right. So let's dive into the world of attachment. So I will say that the classical attachment theory is interesting and very helpful as a foundation, and very flawed for many, many reasons. And so I will give some reference to the classical concepts of attachment and also deviate from that. So, classical attachment is typically associated with, for example, the early relationship between the infant and the mother, which is a very limited concept of caregiving, especially when we look at from a multicultural perspective, where in some cultures, a collective are the caregivers, yeah, etc. So one of the ways I want to kind of redefine what attachment is, and I'll read the definition, we'll talk a little bit about it, is attachment is the way in which a person forms intimate bonds with themselves, and that we might say is embodiment, the way in which we have formed a sense of interconnection within ourselves, a sense of who and how we are from the inside, not from the outside. Those intimate bonds with other people and the environment. Yeah. These bonds form the supportive foundation to be adaptive, to learn and grow from new experiences and flourish in one's goals and relationships. Meaning that when we are in this reciprocity of this exchange, this flow between myself, for example, and another person, or myself and the environment, I am in a constant process of learning, of gathering information, to be able to be adaptive in this present moment, to learn, to grow, to have new experiences, because we're in this present exchange. Yeah. So our attachment are these early infinite intimate bonds that we'll look at how they form in just a few moments. And one of the things it's helpful to look at is we classically, these intimate bonds, so our attachment, the way we were able to form these bonds, are typically thought of that they just show up in our relationships. Yeah. Which there is validity to that, meaning our early relational patterns with our caregivers do show up in our later relationships, but they don't just show up there. They show up everywhere. They show up in our relationship to ourselves. Yeah. They show up in our breath. They show up in our behaviors. They show up in our, as I mentioned, our sense of self. They show up in our tension levels, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. They show up in our way of coping with stress. They show up even in our body posturing, which we'll talk a little bit about later as well, or in our attitude or our perception of the world. So these intimate bonds that we form with ourself, with the environment, so with the earth, with space, with another person's or other persons, yeah, they will have a significant effect on how we perceive the world, how we hold ourselves in our own body, how our own breath is able to move or be challenged. So let's look at the processes of when, as we did in our first practice, we'll look at what happens when we're really able to form those intimate bonds. Yeah. Again, what we're referencing traditionally is the intimate bond between ourselves and a caregiver, but that's not our only intimate bond. And that's really important to recognize. We might still be able to bond with ourselves, or be able to bond even with the way you did with the chair, or the way that you did with something in the space. We can still bond with our environment, even when there were challenges with other people. But let's say there was the conditions that allowed for those intimate bonds to form with ease. Yeah. So there was that co-regulation that was present, meaning that a caregiver or caregivers was able to address their own experiences, their own feelings, their own responses in their nervous system in order to be present with what was happening in ours. As infants, we're not able to self-regulate to the degree we can as adults. And so we rely on our caregivers' abilities, skills, abilities, to be able to regulate themselves, and as an extension of that, us. And when a caregiver is consistent, when they're present, when they're attuned, when they're emotionally responsive, when they're receptive and expressive, when they're able to receive and express back to us, that forms a sense of security, safety, a sense of being seen, being recognized, being heard. And typically it allows the infant to authentically express themselves as well. So it allows them to be received, be seen, be heard by other people. And when there's a safe, secure environment, then the infant is allowed to be curious, to explore themselves, to explore other relationships, to explore the environment. Yeah, and so that exploration keeps building more intimate bonds over time. And what we've seen in the research, the studies, that this, when there is presence, when there is attunement, when there is a emotionally responsive caregiver, when they're expressive, when they're able to receive us and be consistent, that leads to, for the infant, a sense of self-esteem, a social competence. They're able to be fluid and move through various social relationships. There's a sense of agency or self-control. Empathy, they're able to relate to themselves, other people or the environment with compassion and connection. There's a sense of resilience, specifically ego resilience. So even as something challenging happens, they have a consistent sense of who they are. And they're able to give and accept care, which is hard for many of us. Yeah. So one of the things I want to just name is, I imagine many of us are parents, and all of us are children of children. So that we know is true. Yeah. And when I say that, what I'm referencing is, I don't know any parent, I've worked in the field for a long time, that's 100% all the time present, attuned, emotionally responsive, consistent. So we call it good enough secure bonding. Yeah. And that's really important, that as we go back and we maybe think about our own experience, or we are a caregiver, to have empathy, that no one is 100% present all the time. So are they consistent enough? Were they consistent enough? Were we consistent enough? Yeah. To form these intimate bonds. It doesn't have to be 100%. Yeah. So one of the things we want to go from is, this is an ideal situation, and where there are enough support systems, there is enough resources, etc., where caregivers are able to have this sense of presence, attunement, emotional responsiveness, etc., enough. And now the truth of the matter is, that's just not always available for a multitude of reasons. And so we're going to look at that process. And we talk, and that process is what happens when these intimate bonds essentially get interrupted, when they get thwarted, when they get challenged. Yeah. And we call this missed opportunities for bonding, or forming that intimate bond. And that might be, again, with ourselves, with our caregivers, with the environment. And we often refer to these as wounds. So these missed opportunities actually can be experienced as physical pain. Yeah. Our sense of, we are evolutionarily designed to be relational, even if we like our alone time. Yeah, which I love. Yeah, we are evolutionally designed to be social beings. And we can see that even, like, whether it's a breakup or something like that, we feel that heartache. Yeah. And that is our evolutionary design to ideally maintain social connection, social bonding for our own survival. So it's layered into our evolutionary system to bond. And so there are these wounds that emerge as part of missed opportunities for that consistent present bond. And we can identify that as trauma as well. Yeah. So trauma, as you probably have heard throughout this summit, is not an event. Trauma is an experience where there is too much too soon, when there's too much for too long, meaning that it's beyond our capacity to metabolize. Yeah. When there's not enough for too long. So when there's not enough stimulus, when there's not enough consistency, when there's not enough presence for too long. When there's power and agency that's been taken away from a person or a collective. When the stressors outweigh the resources available to navigate them. Yeah, so these are all sort of aspects of trauma that we'll start to see that they show up in our early developmental period, create these attachment wounds. When our primal protective instincts, intuitions, and responses are thwarted. When there's not enough time, space, or permission to heal. Yeah. So these are ways we can define the aspects of trauma. So an attachment wound, as I mentioned before, is a disruption or overwhelm to our body-mind's capacity to feel safe, secure, cared for, and consistently connected with. So as I mentioned before, that aspect of secure bonding, where there was a sense of safety, when there's a sense of being cared for, received and being received, consistency, when there's an interruption to that, we call it an attachment wound. One of the important differentials between the traditional literature and where I'd like to talk about is resources that allow someone to be present, to be consistent. In the classical literature, it mostly just kind of puts the blame on, well, specifically it was the mother, yeah, and it put the blame there, as opposed to looking at what are the systems in our culture, in our government, in our community, in our home that are not available, that allow someone to feel, as a caregiver, to feel safe, secure, supported, to then be able to then present that to a child. And so it's really important to sort of redefine our concepts of attachment from blame to actually more of an empathetic recognition of where resources were not available for generations to feel supported, safe, healed in their own wounds or trauma. Yeah. So as we enter in to what are the sort of ramifications of when these when this intimate bonds are not formed, I think it's really important to come from a place of empathy and support. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to look at 3 different variations of what might happen when, or 3 different variations of kind of attachment wounds. Yeah, and so the first is an anxious attachment. And the caregiver, this is coming from more of the traditional literature, the caregiver is often inconsistent. Yeah. And inconsistent, and there's an indifferentness, sometimes an enthusiasm another time. And then sometimes, yeah, there's not enough stimulation. There's not enough presence. So I'm gonna stop my screen share for just a moment. Yeah, and I'm gonna come back to it. And I'd like us to do a little practice with this. So let's say here I am as a caregiver, And I'm offering you something. So I'm reaching towards you. Yeah. And in the beginning, in this, time, you're able to receive it. So what would the gesture be of receiving this? Yeah. Yeah. And then over time, I start to bring something to you, and then I pull it away. What do you imagine the gesture might be? Yeah, like a reaching, a grasping. Yeah. Like it's almost like falling out of ourself, going for something. Yeah. And as we look at this insecure, anxious attachment pattern, let's all do this together, if that's okay. Just for a moment, kind of like reach for something that makes you almost fall out of yourself or out of your seat, out of your support. And just notice how that feels. Yeah. So let's go back. So we have a little embodiment experience of that. Yeah. And that's often the sort of full body experience in this anxious attachment pattern. Like there's a sense of reaching for something that might be there, but also likely not there. Yeah. So the infant alternates between like a clinging and a resisting the caregiver because it's inconsistent. Yeah. And they show distress when left alone. And then when a caregiver comes back, this is from the classical literature, they're kind of ambivalent. It takes them a while to warm up. They're not sure how to respond upon the return. And so how that manifests as adults is that it becomes an over-responsive nervous system. Are you going to? Is this the time? Should I be ready for you to show up? Yeah. So I have to be vigilant. Yeah, I have to be vigilant to when it might show up. I'm just going to pick up my dog because he's wanting to be held. So here's my little guy. So people with, going back, there's often how it shows up in the sort of personality, we might say, or is that there's often a lot of worry or trust of other people. So there's a lot of challenge with trust and that they believe at the same time that their own sense of safety and comfort can only come from another person, from the presence of another person. So that, again, there's, I think the negative word, people say needy, but it's like what they're grasping for is a sense of, can you come here? Because I've fallen out of myself too many times reaching for someone to show up, that I no longer know how to self-soothe, to hang out here, to feel a sense of secure bond with myself. Yeah. And so there tends to be a dependency on relationships. There's often a sense of a low self-esteem, low self-worth, and often overstimulated with challenges. So that hyper-responsiveness in the nervous system makes them also often feel overstimulated, overwhelmed very quickly. And there's a challenge then to how to self-regulate, how to self-soothe, how to self-support. And there's often usually association, a challenge with communication of needs or being in touch with their needs, being able to communicate their needs, but they'll act them out. Yeah. So I really needed you to show up. So I just showed up at your door. Yeah. So it's like that. What I could have just said is, hey, I need you to show up, but I'm not able to articulate that need. And so there's an acting out in a way that doesn't always help them to be seen, to be connected with. Yeah. And so there's there's a way in which we are repeating our own patterns. Yeah. So the second of 3 insecure attachment styles is the insecure avoidant attachment. Yeah. And this is where in the research, a caregiver may be more impatient. They're not able to just stay with us. They're not very responsive, or there's way too much stimulation. So let's do a gesture again. Yeah. If I'm going to come towards the screen. Yeah. So I'm just forewarning you, a little trigger warning. So if I have a lot of stimulation, hi. Yeah. What's the gesture that you might want to do? Yeah. Yeah. I see someone backing up. I see one person going, that's really sweet. Yeah. So, yeah, many of us are doing like this. Oh, no. And I'm backing away. Yeah. And notice in the gesture kind of how the tension of your body is to maintain that. Yeah. So I'm going to come in again. So just notice that. Hi. Yeah, notice the tension that needs to be maintained in order to create distance and a solid wall. Yeah. So let's go back to our slides and correlate that to an avoidant attachment style. And no one is 100% anything. It's a spectrum. Yeah, so it's not like one person is going to have all of these types of responses. Yeah. So as infants, an infant who is experiencing this process with the caregiver will interact very little with the caregiver. They'll show little, if none, distress when the caregiver leaves the room and totally avoids or ignores them upon their return. Yeah. If you call up your parents and you're like, did I do this? They might not have noticed. This is like, this very clear description was observed through many studies. I just want to name that. Like if you call your parent, you're like, hey, happy Father's Day. Did I show any distress when you left the room? They may not know or remember. So just a heads up. But how it shows up as an adult is it's this. It's like wearing a heavy winter coat all the time. Yeah, which is super great if you live in a frozen tundra. Yeah, or a very overstimulated environment, but not so helpful if we carry the analogy over to when you want to go visit the desert or when it becomes summer. Yeah, meaning that we carry this pattern with us and we're no longer able to be adaptive to our environmental circumstances or the various people we are with. So we continue to wear this heavy duty coat in all of our relationships, in all of our ways we might attend work or school. And how this attachment style shows up is an under-responsive nervous system, so hypo-responsive, versus the other one, which is hyper-responsive. What do we do if there's a lot of stimulation or a stimulation that we don't want to feel? We put the brakes on it. Yeah, so we become hypo-responsive, under-responsive. We might even shut down. We might often just move away and stay away, maintain a significant amount of distance, even when I'm being intimate. I can be right next to someone and not quite be there. Yeah. And we often, or these individuals will often minimize their own needs. It's not really important. Yeah. There's a dismissal of their own needs. And sometimes other people in that way, because there's a challenge of recognizing the value of needs. So they often suppress emotions to protect vulnerability. It's to maintain that protection. They downplay the importance of relationships. and avid connections and appear extremely self-reliant. It helps to maintain the wall of protection. Yeah. But it's not even a conscious choice. It's like I, as an infant, put on a winter coat to survive because it was really cold in my environment. And I just didn't even, as time went on, that coat became a part of who I thought I was and how I saw the world, how I even took my breaths. And so I didn't know I could take it off. I didn't know I had other choices, because also if we go back to that, what I had said earlier, there's no timestamp. I'm still living out that wound. Yeah. My body memory is still living that attachment wound. And one other piece is in this responsive style, or insecure avoiding attachment style, there's a sense that other people are not there to offer safety and comfort, yeah. Which is a perception that manifests because they're not able to have that receiving and being received, yeah, that we looked at earlier. All right, let's look at one more style. So this is called insecure disorganized. This is also called disoriented or fearful attachment. So there are a few names for this style. This is a more rare style, and it often will come when there is significant trauma in the early developmental process, like neglect, like abuse. Yeah. And of course, we can always go into, well, we won't be, but we can always define neglect and abuse kind of in our own terms. As infants, they'll often look like there's a sense of confusion, disorientation, or dissociation, or even fear in the presence of a caregiver. Yeah. And as adults, what that will look like is a hybrid between the last two styles. So between the grasping and the reaching and the winter coat. Yeah, so they'll oscillate between the two styles. Yeah. There tends to be more freeze or dissociation or disconnection from their own body or the environment. Yeah. And it can feel like someone is saying, come closer, go away at the same time or near each other. And there's often a negative perspective that emerges. Again, the perspective emerges from the survival strategy of these attachment wounds. So the perception is that people are not safe. Yeah. And I'm not safe. Yeah. All right. So we covered the secure attachment. Yeah. When that intimate bonding can occur. And we looked at when there's wounding or when there's missed opportunities for that bonding to occur, the various kind of survival strategies. And some of that survival strategy is based on what's happening in our environment or what's happening with our caregivers. Yeah. If you're asking questions, I actually, just so you know, I won't be able to see the questions come in when I'm sharing your PowerPoint. Yeah. So we have 2 more slides. Okay. So I mentioned this before and I want to say it again. So where do these attachment wounds show up? Traditionally, it was just thought of as they show up between me and another person, usually later in adulthood, in intimate relationships. Yeah. But we actually now recognize, especially from a somatic attachment perspective, that they very much show up in our relationship to ourselves. Yeah. They show up in how we are with other people, which I just mentioned, and they show up with our relationship to the environment. And through that, our perception of the world, is the world a safe place? Is the world a place I can trust? Are there people in the world I can trust? And so my perception of the world can actually be constructed through the way I have adapted to the attachment wounds. Yeah. And they might show up in various aspects of ourself as physical symptoms, literally like body tension. Remember when we went to like grasping and the sort of falling off ourselves, or we went to the coat. Yeah. So that those both have these body posturings or muscle tension, muscle responses in reaction to our compensatory response, to our survival strategy. And so that might show up as chronic muscle tension. No matter how many massages we get, for some reason, I just keep getting this sort of like knot in my back. Yeah. Or for whatever reason, there's always just this shallowness in my breath, no matter how much breath work I've done. Yeah. They might show up as emotional symptoms or responses. You know, I might be more flat, or I might be very big responses. Yeah. I might have a lot of challenges identifying my feelings. When I've reached out of myself, or when I'm guarding myself, there's not a lot of space and opportunity to be in contact and relationship to myself or what's happening in myself. It might show up as more psychological symptoms, such as continuous thinking about things, like a rigidity about the way in my thinking, challenges with my boundaries, negative self-talk or negative self-talk about other people. Might even be looked at like as depression or dissociation. And we know that it can show up in my social relational connections. It might show up as a need, like I'm always isolated, but I'm happy that way. Yeah. A sense of lack of fulfillment in relationships. Yeah. An attraction to red flags. Anyone? Yeah. And is challenges with communication, trust, intimacy. Yeah. So, this is some hands raised. Yeah. I'm going to show one more slide, and then I'll stop and we'll talk a little bit more. So one of the, often, you know, when from a somatic attachment therapy, people are often going, okay, I get it. Now what do I do about it? And it's not so simple. Because one of the things over time is not only have we had the wounding, that early developmental, early attachment wounding, but we've also built a way of seeing the world, of identifying in relation to the world. And the other compensatory patterns that are not the actual attachment wound itself, but the way we have survived since then. And so some of it begins with just being aware. Yeah. And it's important to recognize that often our relational patterns are in shadow. Yeah. We might go, why do I just keep dating not nice people? And we keep focusing on them because that's easier than it is to be able to turn the mirror around and see and touch into the wounding, the attachment wound, and the survival strategies that have been built out of that. So bringing more awareness is certainly the first stage from a compassionate place. Again, no one chose to have these survival strategies. No one chose to have the attachment wounds. So as adults, the first thing we can maybe offer ourselves is a compassionate inquiry as to what's happening. Not necessarily the why. why will just bring us back on the merry-go-round of thought, of narrative, and away from what is happening. Yeah. Perhaps even, when we went through just the gestures of like the reaching or the wall, perhaps something in that felt familiar or feels familiar. So that compassionate inquiry of awareness is where we actually want to begin. And then this is just a very simple map, but traditionally, and this is where we can begin to deviate and bring in somatics, is old school attachment work was really focused on like figuring it out in a relational context, usually with a therapist, sometimes between two people and a therapist. Yeah, so it was really about like out here. There was very little relationship to one's own body responses or how they were feeling or experiencing. Yeah. And very little work, if none, on actually coming into a somatic healing process. How do I find and address the wound? How do I rebuild intimate bonds as an adult or as a kid? So one of the things that we can also recognize is we don't have to just do the work with another person to be doing attachment-based therapy or healing. Sometimes the work really is about how do we come back into relationship with ourselves. And often in somatics, we'll go there first. How do we come back into my own breath, my own sensation, just a feeling of being able to of moving and being able to feel my own movement. Again, how do we come back to our primal language where all of this was formed, including my sense of self? So a lot of our work starts with how do we come back home to ourselves? How do we feel our own tissues? Yeah, how do we come into contact with our own feelings and needs? And we can work with other ways of bonding. I can go out into nature. Maybe that's a safe place. And just feel this exchange, this reciprocal process. And notice where it feels hard and be in relationship, be in awareness and conversation with the challenge of receiving or being received. Or I can go and do this work with another person and they all feed each other. Yeah, the work we do with our environment, being able to just settle into gravity and be supported by the earth will actually have ramifications into how we experience ourselves. How we experience ourselves will have ramifications on how we are in relationship with others. And so they feed into each other. There's no one direct universal path of healing attachment wounds. We're all on our own journey, and there are guideposts for those journeys, but we're all on our own process of reconnecting to ourselves, to the environment, or something beyond just our own body and other people. I'm going to stop my screen share. Whew, that was a lot of information. How are we doing? Yeah. So I just want to name, there's a reason why we started with that first practice. Yeah. Of finding a little bit of movement, feeling just a sense of weight, feeling maybe a little, we didn't add too much of that, but just a sense of our own body connecting with our own body. I did that more through inviting like the weight of our head just to can flow into another part of us. It may not sound like super sophisticated, like fancy therapy, but the reality is we don't need that. Yeah. It doesn't often work anyways, so sorry. But what does often work is the rebuilding of our sense of self. And that's what we did in our first practice. just an inroad. Yeah, there are lots of different practices into the body, into the soma, into our own being. Yeah, lots of practices. And then we brought in another person, if that was possible today. And we noticed if it was available to have that exchange, that same sense of reciprocity, flow. And if we notice no, great. As I said before, that is wisdom. That is compassionate inquiry and awareness. Yeah. And then we brought it out into our environment. Yeah. Like a flower I have here, or whatever it is, and that same reciprocity, or the earth, that's our environment. Often when we didn't have safe environments or sturdy environments in our youth, we might create them, and we didn't even recognize we've been creating them in our own space as adults. And so how to actually start to receive what you've been creating, something different than maybe what was available to you. And then we did just a final practice, just, coming into breath, that sense of exchange, that we are already in a relationship, even if we're not aware of it. Yeah. You might say you hold your breath, but the fact that you're still here watching this says otherwise. And so you are in some relationship, and to be able to focus on where there is already relationship, not just where there is not, is a beautiful place to start. It builds our confidence. It builds our confidence that we are intimate, that we are made of intimate bonds, and that we, even when there have been wounds, we still have formed some. So I know there's many questions about, like, how do I differentiate, or how do I go there? How do I learn? But it really starts with just a compassionate inquiry and awareness of letting perhaps what's been in shadow of our own relational processes have a little more light, and to find where we are already in relationships, where there is already secure bonds. Even if it's just that I do allow air to come in, oxygen to come in, and carbon dioxide to come out. Even if it's something as simple as that. And we build the felt sense of relationship up. And then we expand that to places where there is more challenges or wounding. Yeah. And we process what comes up along the way. We don't have to know we don't have to know the narrative story. We just have to be in relationship to ourselves and what's happening for the healing. And I don't want to just say just the healing, because sometimes somatic attachment work can also just be about enhancing, diving deeper into the felt sense of that secure bonds that we have formed or are forming. Yeah. And that's a beautiful process as well. Well, my friends, that was a very quick hour and 15 minutes. I'm sad we have to depart, but hopefully we get to hang out more in the future and play with this really beautiful material. I mean, I truly believe that, when we start to recognize that everything is relationships, that we are comprised of relationships, reciprocal, and with the opportunity for reciprocal relationships, whether that's in community or with the environment or with ourselves. I think that just how fundamental this type of work is for global healing, personal and global healing. So thank you for your beautiful presence and hanging out with me. It was such a wonderful treat to present some of this material that I love with each of you as part of this summit. And thank you for attending this summit. We love doing them, and so we're so grateful that you could join us and be part of it and be part of the community of it.